Right. So we're gonna start our series of webinars. I want to welcome everyone. My name is Sonia Parras. I am the executive founder and president of Assista, and we're gonna be presenting today topics on sexual violence in the workplace and how to challenge sexual violence in the workplace. But before we start, and we have Debbie tell us all about it, Debbie Smith. Maria Lazarino is going to give us some information about housekeeping issues and how to interact with us during the webinar. Maria?
Yes, hello, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, there is a box on the right side of your screen. There is a chat. If you have any issue connecting on some issues, please write in there. There is another question box that you can type questions in there. We will try to read the questions during the webinar, and if there is any question that is no answer, please, after the webinar, send an email to any of the presenters, and we will get back to you. And in case that we ask you to raise the hand, there is a virtual hand that if you touch it, we will see who needs to be open link. So if you have any question, again, use the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. And so we're going to start. We have a lot ahead of us. So Debbie Smith is going to take it from here. Debbie?
Thanks so much. And thanks so much to everybody participating in this. And welcome to the webinar series on challenging sexual violence against immigrant women in the workplace. And my name is Debbie Smith. I work at the International Office of SEIU in Washington, D.C. I'm an Associate General Counsel in Immigration Law. And I wanted to thank all of you for taking time away from your incredibly busy workdays to spend time talking and thinking about how to challenge sexual violence in the workplace, and in particular, sexual violence against immigrant women. We have a great showing of SEIU locals participating in this webinar, and I won't call you out by name, but I do want to acknowledge who we have in the house. We have 32BJ from Florida, a local 1 in Chicago, 32BJ from Boston, local 26 in Minnesota, 1199 Northeast, USWW in California. We have SEIU Texas, 2015 in California, local 99 in California, and the Minnesota State Council. So if I missed any of you, if I missed any of the locals, please type your local name into the dialog box. I want to give you a shout out and thanks again for participating. So over the course of the next 3 months in this 3-part webinar series, we're going to be focusing on the impact of sexual violence in the workplace on one of the most vulnerable populations, immigrant women. And I'll be introducing the webinar, but I also want to introduce our 3 wonderful, amazing speakers, Lauren Bonds, Giselle Haas, and Sonia Parras. She's already, you've already heard her speak. So many of you already know Lauren. Lauren worked as an attorney at SEIU's International Legal Department for 4 years, working on the Fight for 15 campaign, but she's now the legal director of the ACLU of Kansas. Lauren, we miss you, and we really appreciate you joining us for this webinar series. Giselle Haas is a licensed clinical and forensic psychologist, board diplomat in assessment psychology, who for the past 25 years has worked as a forensic expert in family law for local and national courts, specifically in custody, divorce, child abuse, neglect, domestic violence, and cross-multicultural mental health. Sonia Parras Conrad is an immigration attorney in Florida. She's already introduced herself as the co-founder and president of Assista, a nonprofit that's focused on advancing the rights and status of immigrant survivors of domestic violence. And I did want to point out that Sonia has worked with immigrant survivors for many years and played a key role in representing immigrant women who were arrested in one of the biggest workplace raids ever at a meatpacking plant in Postville, Iowa, 10 years ago. So when we started talking about putting together this webinar series for SEIU local staff and organizers over a year ago, little did we know that Donald Trump's own history of sexual assaults on women and the Me Too movement would shine a light, or a spotlight really, on violence against women at the highest levels of power in our country. But with this spotlight on sexual violence, it's more relevant now than ever that we consider sexual violence against women in the workplace, and in particular, its impact on immigrant women. So at the International Union, SEIU International, the staff are already working on immigration issues and generally, but we've identified sexual violence in the workplace as an emerging issue that we want to focus on for organizers around the country. Next slide, please. Did the slide move? I can't tell. Doesn't look like it. Okay, well, I can't tell if it's moved or not, but I'm going to go over and talk a little bit. Can anyone see, has the slide moved? Lauren, did it move on yours?
It didn't on mine. I should maybe refresh.
Me neither.
So.
No, it has not.
Maybe. Okay, there we go. Thank you. So I want to talk just a little bit about the overall project goal and what the purpose of this webinar series is. And of course, we want to provide SEIU organizers and staff with a background needed to challenge and eradicate sexual violence in the workplace. And one of the first steps that we can take to achieve that is by bringing together allies and creating ongoing collaborations, cooperations, partnerships between labor and anti-violence advocates so that we can create best practice models and long-term partnerships. We also want to give you the tools to help identify immigrant survivors of sexual violence in the workplace and the best ways to help people. And so how is this relevant to your work? Well, we've seen high-profile Hollywood stars, politicians, and others come forward to call out sexual violence in Hollywood, Congress, and Silicon Valley. But what about the ordinary workers, and especially immigrant workers? A documentary, Rape on the Night Shift, told the story that many of you are all too familiar with, the assaults against immigrant women janitors and working women, many of whom are in our union. So this is an issue that's key to many segments of our union. And in the third webinar, we're going to be talking about some of the contract language that our local USWW in California has been able to put into contracts to protect immigrant working women. Next slide, please. Still hasn't moved. Okay, well, there we go. So for our agenda today, we're going to start off with Lauren discussing what the legal definition of sexual violence in the workplace is. We're going to look at some of the basic protections. We'll go deeply into some of the legal remedies in our third webinar series in March. And Lauren will also look at some scenarios and hypos to help understand what is sexual violence. When is it being rude, and when does it constitute something more, something illegal? Sonia is going to take a look at how sexual violence appears, how you identify it, what you might see, what questions can you ask, and how to ask the hard questions when working with the survivors of this kind of violence. Sonia will also explain the risks of reporting and what the impact of being coerced, emotional and long-term consequences, and how to document and refer to experts. Giselle will explain considerations and things to think about when you're working with the survivors of sexual violence. So thank you very much, and we're going to jump into the webinar right now. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Debbie. So I just want to preface this by saying, here at the ACLU of Kansas, I haven't had done a ton of work on sexual harassment or sexual violence in the workplace. My familiarity with the topic comes from when I was working on the Fight for 15 campaign at SEIU. And a reason that, this became something we ran a field campaign on and something that our campaign dedicated a lot of time to addressing is because it was what organizers were hearing about when they were out in the field. And I think that's why it's so awesome that so many organizers are on this call right now and doing this training, is because I think if there's going to be someone who's going to hear about these issues and hear about these things happening to workers in the workplace, if workers are going to tell somebody about it, it's going to be their organizer. It's going to be the person who they're talking about all their other workplace grievances about. And so even though, sexual harassment has so much stigma around it and, so much shame associated with it, I really think organizers are in a unique position to empower women and hear their stories and give them the opportunity to vindicate their rights in the workplace. So, just to, piggyback off of what Debbie said, it's so great you guys are here. And I think that we're at a really critical time where there's an opportunity for women to really raise their voices and assert their rights in the workplace. So I'm glad you're here. So I'll go ahead and just start by giving an overview of what sexual harassment is, the legal definition. And so, when we're thinking about sexual violence, I think that has kind of extreme connotations. You're thinking that's rape, that's, kind of aggravated sexual assault. But, in the workplace, there's a higher standard of what your coworkers and what your employer has to do towards you. And so it prohibits more conduct than we might otherwise consider to be quote unquote sexual violence. So the legal definition of sexual harassment is any unwelcome sexual advance or request for sexual favors that interferes with a worker's performance or creates a hostile, intimidating, or offensive work environment. It's just, for background, it's a claim you bring against the company. It's not a claim you bring against an individual. And there are federal law protections as well as state law protections. And sometimes if it's, a very extreme form of harassment, it could raise to a criminal violation as well. Next slide, please. Okay. And so I covered a little bit of this, but it can be either physical, verbal, or visual. And it doesn't have to be, traditionally we think about this as, men harassing women, men can harass other men, women can harass women, women can harass men. There really is no traditional way that this happens. I think it happens, a lot of different people experience this in the workplace. And the law protects all different types of plaintiffs who could bring claims. Next slide, please. I also want to point out that this is an issue. This is an issue that is broader than just what you might consider sexual violence. So sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination are also types of sexual harassment that are prohibited by law. Any ongoing pattern of comments or rumors about sexual orientation has been found to violate federal law. Harassment has also been found when the employer intentionally or persistently misgenders or dead names a transgender worker. And the EEOC, even under the Trump administration, has shown some interest in pursuing these types of cases, even though it's not clear how the federal courts will decide on that. So I think that if you hear from any workers that are, talking about these types of issues, that are experiencing this type of discrimination, it is always worth trying to file a complaint, trying to file a grievance, trying to, push back against this behavior through legal action. And some states have went further than the federal law and have specifically passed laws protecting LGBTQI workers. So I know Texas is on here, SEIU Texas, maybe not Texas, but, I think if we have anyone from California on here, all of those classes of people would be protected right now. So next slide, please. And so here's just a quick map of the different states that have passed protections for LGBTQI individuals in the workplace. So like I said, Texas is not a great place for this. California is, Illinois is, and so definitely refer to this map if you're wondering if that is the kind of conduct that is legally prohibited. Next slide, please. So I want to talk very quickly about the different types of harassment. So, as I mentioned, harassment is a little different from what we would normally think of as, sexual violence. So it generally comes in two forms: quid pro quo and a hostile work environment. So under the quid pro quo standard, this can only be committed by supervisors. This happens when a supervisor offers an employee a job benefit in exchange for a sexual favor or a date, or they withhold a benefit after the worker rejects their advances. So I'll give you an example. If a supervisor says, "I'll give you more hours if you have sex with me," that is a clear quid pro quo sexual harassment violation. Same if it wasn't so explicit, if it says, "Why don't you have dinner with me?" and then maybe we can talk about giving you a raise. It doesn't have to be do this and get this. It can be something that's, more of an implied offer. And as I mentioned, it can also occur when you're withholding benefits for rejecting advances. So if a supervisor cuts a worker's hours for refusing to go on a date with him, that's going to constitute sexual harassment. If a supervisor starts writing up a worker for, everything after she tells him not to grope her anymore, that would also be quid pro quo harassment. It might also be hostile work environment harassment, which we'll talk about in a second. So now I want to just run through a quick hypothetical, and this is an example I actually got from one of our Fight for 15 organizers regarding quid pro quo harassment. Next slide, please. Okay, sorry. I thought the hypo slide was still in there. 1 second. We'll go ahead and do the hypo, and then we'll cover hostile work environment harassment. So Amelia was dating the assistant manager at her store for 4 months. The assistant manager is in charge of scheduling and gives Amelia first priority to pick up more hours when someone calls in. Amelia decides she wants to be single and breaks up with the assistant manager. After that, the assistant manager stops giving her priority treatment. When Amelia confronts her assistant manager about it, he tells her that only his girlfriends get priority and that she can have preferential treatment back when she takes him back and they get back together. Do you guys think she has a claim for quid pro quo sexual harassment under these circumstances? So I don't know the best way to do this on the webinar, if we can do a hands up, but I'll go ahead and just talk through this one. So I think she does have a claim, or she's very close to having a claim. This is definitely something she should, submit a grievance about, go to HR about. It's definitely, an incident where he's withholding a benefit he used to give to her because they're no longer in a romantic relationship. So it's kind of a punitive quid pro quo situation. So now I'll talk a little bit about the second type of actionable harassment claim, which is a hostile work environment claim. And so the slide's up for this. So this, unlike quid pro quo, which can only come from a supervisor, hostile work environment harassment can be a supervisor, a coworker, or even a customer or a client. And to prove this, there's a number of things you have to show. So first, you have to show it's unwelcome. So consensual relationships generally are not going to be a basis for a hostile work environment harassment claim. That'll usually come under quid pro quo if there's a situation where someone feels coerced into a consensual relationship to get benefits. That'll be quid pro quo. Hostile work environment, it's got to be unwelcome. And then you have to also prove that the conduct you're experiencing is either severe or pervasive. So it can be a combination of both. But really bad conduct only needs to happen once, but less severe conduct needs to happen repeatedly. So what's considered severe, most physical contact is going to raise to that level of severe conduct. So groping, inappropriate touching, sexual assault, things that are less severe but still might hit that standard and are non-physical, sending or posting pictures of your genitals, or, putting things like that around the work site. verbal, usually just words aren't going to be enough to create a severe hostile work environment, but, threats of rape or sexual assault can reach to that level, or a very graphic comment about an employee's body. Less severe conduct, as I mentioned, needs to be pervasive. It needs to be happening regularly. It needs to, be so common that it, is a condition of the workplace, basically. So, what's considered pervasive? If a supervisor, is regularly giving workers unwanted hugs, like if that happens every day, even though that's not that bad of behavior, added up over time, that's going to make anyone feel very uncomfortable in their workplace. Other intimate but not overtly sexual touching from a supervisor that happens, more than 3 times a month, I think, is the legal standard in a lot of places. That's going to constitute a pervasive hostile work environment. And, verbal repeated requests for a date after you turn them down, that's going to constitute pervasive as well. And so it's also worth noting that even though coworkers and customers can create a hostile work environment, the company or the employer is only going to be on the hook if the worker can prove that the management knew or should have known about the harassment, and then they didn't do anything to stop it. And so there's also another category of times when management can get in trouble for the work or for the behavior of coworkers and customers, and that's if they don't have a system for workers, a policy for workers to make reports or a way for people to make complaints. And so hopefully most of you guys have those in your contracts, good systems, or at least requiring that a system exists. But generally, the management has to know about it or should know about it, or they don't have a policy. Those are usually the 2 standards. And so I'll do another quick hypothetical. So Jordan and Michelle are coworkers. They're working the same shift. Jordan puts his hands down Michelle's pants and tells her to meet him at his car after work. Michelle's disgusted and doesn't want to work with Jordan in the future. Do you guys think she would have a sexual harassment claim? So I see a hand, but I don't know what to do with it. So, so I'll just tell you that, I think it would really depend. So him doing that once, that's probably severe and pervasive, or that's probably severe enough for it to constitute sexual harassment. It's really, but since he's her coworker, it really depends on what management does after she reports it. So if management knows about it and says, oh, Jordan, he's just funny like that, just, do your best to avoid him, that might be sufficient to create liability for the employer. But if management says, you know what, that's unacceptable, we're firing Jordan, or we're suspending Jordan until we investigate it, there's probably not a sexual harassment claim there, even though Michelle in that situation was sexually harassed. Next slide, please. Okay, that was a hypothetical. Next slide, please. Okay. So, as I mentioned, it's very important in order for a worker to be able to prove sexual harassment that they, make sure that their employer is aware of it, even if it's the manager who's doing it, or the shift supervisor, or the leader of the shift. It's always important that there's a report made. So there's a standard called the Farragher-Ellerith defense that the employer is going to be able to avoid liability if the worker didn't take certain steps to report it and remedy the situation. And so I think this is really important to communicate to workers who might be dealing with these type of work environments, because it's going to give them an opportunity to make sure that their employer is accountable if they are in a hostile work environment or dealing with quid pro quo harassment. So what they have to do to make sure the employer is liable, they have to make sure that they report it, as I mentioned. And the employer is not going to be liable if after they receive a report, they take reasonable steps to prevent and correct harassment in the workplace. So if they have a system for reporting and investigating, that's usually going to be enough. Courts usually don't second guess the results of an employer's investigation. So those are kind of the baseline things. They have a system for receiving complaints and a system for conducting investigations. So again, the employee really has to make sure that they're taking advantage of that system if it's in place. They're making a formal report. They're complaining about it in a way that their employer would reasonably expect to receive complaints. And workers should report harassment when possible. However, there are some legal exceptions. They do not have to report harassment when the company lacks an anti-harassment policy. So if there's not a system for reporting, they don't need to figure out who and where they need to make these complaints to. If there is a policy and the worker can only report their harassment to their harasser, so if it's a situation where their manager or their supervisor is harassing them and that's the only person they can make a complaint to under their policy, they're not going to be obligated to make a report under that situation. And workers should report in the method that's prescribed in the policy, but if it's unreasonable, once again, they're not going to be held to that standard. But once again, we should always encourage workers to report it when possible and use the company system for reporting the policy. Next slide, please. And so I just want to quickly wrap up with a discussion of retaliation. So in addition to the types of harassment that are prohibited under sexual harassment laws, there's also another violation that workers can assert and defend against, and that's retaliation. So retaliation is exactly what it sounds like and something you guys are all familiar with as organizers. But it's unfortunately an extremely common phenomenon. When women do come forward and do speak out and do report harassment, they're going to be retaliated against. And that can come in a lot of forms. So, the worker can start receiving fewer hours. They can be moved to a less desirable shift. They can be demoted. Their work can be, scrutinized more closely. And a lot of times it's, it might be something related to their immigration status. They might say, they might use their immigration status as leverage to pry down the worker or to make them accept a quote unquote remedy for the harassment that should be unacceptable and should be something that they shouldn't have to deal with. So I think it's always important that, when a worker's telling you about a remedy that they received after they've made a complaint, that it's not a remedy, it's not retaliation disguised as a remedy, that it's really, a situation where they feel safe and isn't a negative outcome and isn't a negative work situation for them. So that's kind of retaliation in a nutshell. And I think, if at any time you do file a charge on behalf of a worker or file a grievance on behalf of a worker, you should make sure you're checking in with them regularly to make sure that they're not experiencing any kind of retaliation for coming forward and speaking up. And so, yeah, I think that is all, those are the basics. That's, sexual harassment, legal 101. And I'm happy to answer any questions folks might have. And I think, it's just really important that you have your ear to the ground and be paying attention to when workers are talking to you about these things, and making sure that you're doing what you can to, inform them about their rights and empower them to take steps to protect themselves in these situations as well. Because you guys are in such a unique, important position for empowering women who are in these situations.
All right. Thank you so much for that incredible introduction. Of course, there is a lot more to it, and we will be, as Debbie Smith mentioned at the beginning, talking about this more in depth in our last series of webinars, in our third webinar. What I'm going to do today is to, if we can go to the next slide, please, Maria, is to go over some of the things that you have already heard, but put it more into context. I have had a lot of experiences with survivors of sexual violence in the workplace, representing them, encountering them, referring them, and that's what I want to bring to you to make it more real, for you to think about situations in which you perhaps saw these cases, but did not identify them as such or didn't know what to do about it. So I will go over some of the tips to identify survivors, and then I want to talk about a couple of very important things. When I see a case as a lawyer, organizer, and advocate and fighter for women's rights, immigrant women's rights, I get very excited and I want to immediately get into the action mode and report and make sure that she has everything legally available and service-wise available to her. But I need to stop in my tracks because there are severe risks that are associated with the talking that I need to consider. So as you identify more of these cases, remember the risks. We're going to cover this in a little bit. And then more into the dynamics because there is so much to it, and oftentimes we miss it. We miss it, or we dismiss it, or we don't ask, or we don't use the right language with survivors that may prompt them to disclose. In future webinars, besides the legal remedies, we will also talk about the strategies for working with survivors. We don't want to let you halfway. Now you have the legal remedies, now you have the legal introduction, now you know what it is, and so we want to make sure that you know what to do with it and how others are already doing it. So if we can get to the next slide. I just want to share this with you. I oftentimes encounter, again, so many survivors, and I had the privilege to work with the first few visas in the nation. Those were the DeCoster women. We, along with the EEOC, sued the Coster Ag Farms, and the women settled for $1.5 million. But I want to tell you about my failure. My job was, as an immigration advocate and attorney, go out there, reach out, and explore potential immigration legal remedies. And women kept coming to my legal clinic and my presentations in the central area of Iowa and talking to me about, things that were happening in the workplace. So I quickly separated myself from what they were telling me because in my head, that wasn't my area. I didn't know anything about labor organizing and labor laws, and they were talking to me a lot about wage theft. So I referred them to some agencies that I thought could help them. But I was truly not asking the right questions, and I was truly missing the underlying ongoing sexual harassment, ongoing sexual violence, ongoing rape, and everything that you can imagine that goes with it. It wasn't until I saw them for a third time, this same group of women talked to me, and they were poking each other and saying, "You tell her, no, you tell her," and tell me what are we talking? What do you want to tell me? And then one of them told me, well, I am tired of having sex at work. I didn't really know what to do with that information. I wanted to be open-minded and thought about a million interpretations for that statement until later on I found out through asking more questions and above all listening, more than talking, listening, that the women were being raped, and this was ongoing, and there were a group of supervisors that were also their traffickers that brought them into the DeCoster farms and that used them as sex slaves. So point being, they were talking about some wage theft, and they were upset about labor violations that had an underlying and uncovered ongoing sexual violence in the workplace. When you talk to women, immigrant women, you have a unique opportunity to go deep and at least offer them some information and throw them lifesavers so they can grab onto, and when they're ready, talk to you more about it. Swift and Postville. Postville, again, my job as an immigration lawyer, I already had plenty of experience with survivors of sexual harassment and violence in the workplace. But in Postville, again, my job was, okay, we have this huge group of people that have been placed in removal, that are in the church, that have not been arrested yet, but may be arrested at some point in time. And sure enough, I'm talking to a 15 years old girl, and all she's saying is how hard her work was and how much she worked and how they didn't pay her enough. And because I already had that experience, my questions and the questions that followed was, tell me about your hard work. Because I know the work in the line is horrific, it's super, demanding physically. I haven't done it. But I have heard plenty of details about it. So I could have just dismissed, okay, it's hard. Yeah, the work in the line is hard. Next. But I took my time to ask her, well, describe, what do you mean by that? And sure enough, within 5 minutes, she's telling me that she has to carry boxes when she doesn't go out to have lunch with the supervisor, and that she has to carry boxes of 40 pounds during an 8-hour shift, and that she, often debated whether to just have lunch and get it over with or continue to carry the boxes. And okay, have lunch is a form of sexual harassment, perhaps by a supervisor when you're refusing to do so and you're being punished, but there was more to it. Going out to the restaurant to have lunch, and again, that's the importance of asking and not talking. What did it mean for her and to her? It meant, and it was well known, that when you had lunch with the supervisor, he was just not taking you for a nice lunch and paying your bill. After that, he will take you to a motel where you were supposed to have sex with him, and in exchange for that, quid pro quo, there were a lot of good benefits and stuff that came your way, like choosing your shift, changing shifts, etc. So what I, again, encourage you to do, and based on my failure when encountering these cases, is ask the question, provide the information, listen, don't rush it. We are trained to do a certain job in a certain way, but when we are working on these cases and with survivors, it's very important to unlearn, to listen, and to give an opportunity to provide information and wait and revisit. So many times I talk to survivors, they have disclosed nothing, and it's been in the third time that they have seen me that they had been having conversation and started to disclose instances of harassment. A lot of the survivors endure sexual harassment in silence, and in most of these cases that I work with, it's not just one time, it's weeks and months, and oftentimes sexual harassment is a predecessor to the other physical violence and sexual violence. So always remember that sexual harassment is a red flag for further victimization. If we can go to the next slide, Maria. So what are we talking about? We have an ongoing dialogue in the gender violence, anti-gender violence movement about whether sexual harassment is or is not sexual violence. And my philosophy, argument, and defense in that is that sexual harassment is absolutely a form of sexual violence, a form of gender violence. It's a precursor, a predecessor to the actual violence, and sometimes it's intertwined. It must be addressed immediately and seriously. How many of us are coming from immigrant communities and are not too familiar with sexual harassment and are kind of like dismissing the issues because it's not that bad, and we want to move with our agenda and do other things and focus on other things, like Lauren was saying before, he's just a joker, he's just, and we are among ourselves dismissing those issues that are very serious. And again, the importance of that is that oftentimes they are precursors to sexual violence in the form of rape. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Why does this happen? And why is it so often and so easy for perpetrators to perpetrate sexual violence? It's because they have the power. Sexual violence is not about pleasure. It may come with it, but ultimately it's about power and holding power over others. The power that a supervisor has is to fire, to hire, to retaliate, to continue contracts with family members, to blacklist, to confer certain benefits. And immigrant survivors are often very vulnerable. They face many challenges and many barriers, and you are all too familiar with this. So I'm just going to mention a group of a laundry list, just an example, which is pretty overwhelming, but it's a reality. Cultural barriers about how things work in our country, language barriers. Who is a supervisor and what is the nationality of the supervisor? In Postville, we had a lot of Mexican supervisors that were harassing and sexually assaulting Guatemalan indigenous workers. Lack of education and lack of awareness of their own rights in this country, feeling that because they're undocumented and they may be using false documents, they have no rights whatsoever. Other series of challenges and barriers that they face is the shame that they experience, the embarrassment over these traumatic events. They may fear that they're going to be the gossip of the town, that if they're suffering perhaps domestic violence at home and the husband hears this gossip about this supervisor paying attention to her, that may be the day perhaps that she loses her children, her life, that she's kicked by the batter from her house. They also encounter poverty or not other job. I'm referring again to these like three particular cases of the Custer and Swift and in Marshalltown and Postville, because they were working in extreme isolation. They had no car, they had no bus, no public transportation. They either walked to the job or they got rides with supervisors, and some of the rape happened because of this, lack of mobility and isolation and rights that were given by supervisors or co-workers. And ultimately, they fear to face the court, to face the government. They fear deportation, among other things. If we can go on to the next slide, Maria, please. And Lauren covered this. And, and again, I want to tell you just briefly about my failure. I want to talk about all my failures of identifying the parties. In the Postville case, one of the main perpetrators of sexual assault was a woman. It was a Mexican woman that was physically fondling and penetrating other women with parts of the chicken and other tools that were used at the plant. And because I was coming from my perspective of typical or more often men towards female, I almost missed that whole group of women that were sexually assaulted and violated and raped by this woman that was working with them as a supervisor. And we also encountered cases of kids, because they were 14, 15 years old kids, perpetrated by other men. So as Lauren said, it's important to remember that it's not just men to women, that it could be women to women, men to men, women to men, etc. It could be also an employer, coworker, third party, etc. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So here's a good one. A lot of times I have women that talk to me and they talk in third person, or they talk about something that they heard or that they witnessed. So I found that sometimes it's easier if I start the dialogue as not what is happening to you, what are you experiencing, and putting her on the spot, but stepping back and being broader in terms of the questioning and the interviewing that you're proceeding with. So Have you ever seen any of this happening in your workplace? Have you been a witness to it? And a lot of times that leads to disclosure of, well, a mi amiga to my comadre, and it unfortunately ends up in later on in sessions, well, this happened to me as well. So remember that. And we're going to do a little exercise. So we, again, remember the forms of sexual violence in the context of gender violence and give you some ideas about what questions to ask, what kind of dialogue to have with survivors. And Giselle is going to help us with this. So Maria, if we can go to the next slide, please. And then we're going to do a little exercise, okay? So remember all this, and then we'll do a little exercise on this. So if we can go to the slide of sexual violence in the context of gender violence, I think Giselle is ready to cover this. Giselle?
Yes. Are we going to have the little dialogue, Sonia?
So let's do this first, and then we jump into the exercise.
Okay, no problem. So what happened is that the sexual violence in the context of gender violence can have many different shapes and forms, and it can really go from unwanted offensive words, jokes, innuendo, sexual gestures. It can be sexual exploitation, exploiting you because you're a woman, for instance. If you were in a bar, they will give you certain tables of the guys who are more drunk instead of the other waiter who is a male they may exploit his gender in other ways. It can also be threatening actions if, like Sonia explained, if sexual acts are not performed, or sexual touch such as groping or grabbing, feeling a person. And all this happens without the permission of the person being touched, without asking permission, without her him allowing this to happen or encouraging to happen. And in the most severe forms, it will be sexual assault and rape and other forms of sexual molestation. Next slide.
So let's talk a little bit about this and give it a bit more context. And Giselle, I just want to invite the audience to just listen to our dialogue and conversation and see if they can identify what's happening to our colleagues, right? So, for instance, Giselle, I can tell you one event where, one time my friend Lola was telling me that her coworker keeps telling the male supervisor sexual jokes out loud in front of all the the female workers, but everybody gets super embarrassed about it. And I'm not sure if this is wrong or not, but what Lola is telling me is that since we are all Latinas, then the supervisor starts making fun of all of us, and he starts calling us hot mamas and explain the sexual jokes in detail, like we care about it, and we have to listen in silence. So, so what I think, audience, are we here onto something, or is it just Lola that is being too sensitive?
I would like to hear from the audience. Which kind of sexual abuse do you think that is happening in that example? From the example?
If any, right?
Yeah, if any. From these four that are in the slide, does it fit any of those? Could you just write it up in your little box? I don't see anything. Don't see any answers. Well, it fits the sexualized environment, right? Because this is creating an environment that it is hostile, that it is degrading to the women, that it is obscene, that is using sexual jokes to really control and have power over the women, to demean them. when I will hear something like that from a friend or from the person who's telling you this, I would like to get more information, get information about what have you thought about reporting that, and what do you think will happen if you do, because sometimes they will be afraid of many different negative consequences, fear of being blamed, or just embarrassing, or just thinking that, well, it happens to another woman and she was fired or something. So we want to hear more details about it.
So Maria, if we can go on to the next slide, maybe Giselle and I can keep on talking. Giselle, because you told me also that you have a friend, Conchi, and what's happening with Conchi?
Yeah, Conchi works at a diner, like a restaurant, and she's a waitress from 4 to 10 p.m. And what happened to Conchi is that the owner makes her wear this uniform, but he insists that she must unbutton down to her bra, the top, and that she has to wear a black bra. And then he tells her that she shouldn't be embarrassed of showing what God has given her, and that if she does that, she will get more tips and make the patrons happy. And on top of that, the back of the restaurant where Conchi has to change every day into her uniform has posters of naked women, other obscene pictures of men and women naked, and she doesn't really feel secure. So is this legal, Sonia?
Well, I don't know. What do the audience think? Do you think that perhaps Conchi has a case, or Conchi should be complaining, or is Conchi just too sensitive? And Joseph says, yes, she does. Anybody else concurs with Joseph? You can use your questions to participate or send us a chat if you wish. But in any way, yes. So I think
Sonia, this
Yeah.
is Debbie. I was thinking maybe you could just explain one more time how to use the box. So you click on where it says question.
Sure.
Is that it?
We are getting answers. We are getting answers. You can see Eli Magana also saying yes, she has a case. Joseph, you say it's highly
So
complained as
Joseph,
soon as
Eli,
possible.
Susana, creating sexual environment is not legal. So people are participating. For those of you who are still catching on to the technology, like myself, under the sidebar, you have a way to communicate, either posting a question, which would be actually the answer to our question, or just going to the chat and commenting in there to the entire audience to participate. But so you guys are right on. So Susana, Joseph, Ellie, everybody's right on. So I mean, this has like different different classifications. From indirect sexual abuse, unwanted, indecent advances, proposals, sexual innuendo, intimate references, maybe directly or indirectly. So denying benefits to her because, if she doesn't wear this and be provocative and get more customers to drink or to consume or to, be more sexual to the customers, then she doesn't get continue to get higher or benefits, etc. Also, obviously, the sexualized environment as well. So let's requiring to wear a provocative uniform, general use of obscene language, make allusions to sexual activity or preferences, again, directly or indirectly. Obviously, we will advise Carmen to take good notes, to talk to other coworkers so they can start perhaps getting a group to, if they're not encouraged on their own, complain about it, and make sure that the supervisor, even if he's the only supervisor, is the owner of the establishment, is aware of their complaint and why. But we'll talk more about this. So I think we may have time for one more. We had several scenarios, but Giselle, I just wanted to tell you about Carmen really quick.
Mhm.
So Carmen works at this motel, and she's been getting $7 an hour. Things a bit below what she should, and she's been getting $7 an hour for the past 2 years. Then she finally got the nerve to ask for a raise because she heard that that's not even minimum wage. And the owner told her that if she was sweeter to him, she would get a lot more than just a few cents. Um, what do you think about this?
I
What does
think
the audience?
I would like to hear the audience as well, but I think that this was a coercive proposition. I mean, he's really just saying it in a way that sounds like she has a choice, but he's not giving her a choice, really. Just to give her what is due to her, what she has a right to have. Uh, he is asking her for sexual favors. That's illegal.
So and Carmen is not Carmen, but this is a real case. So what do you think about this? Because Carmen also said that she had sex twice, thinking that if she did, then the owner will actually raise her to $8, uh, which he did. But now the owner continues to make advances and touches her and hugs her every time they're alone. But she feels that since she said yes, right, that she has no recourse, and she feels pretty embarrassed about the whole situation. So do you think
Mhm.
that's the case or not?
Sometimes people get confused when they have consented to something and then it turns into something else, or when they have to withdraw consent, because consent is not something that you do. You do it for every single act, not for everything, right? And in
Right,
this case, I will even challenge the fact that she consented. I think that
right,
she just basically gave up to the pressure and to the coercion, and that is not free will. She was not doing this out of free will like you would do in another situation where you don't have something hanging over your head, that will be a negative consequence.
right. Because and we heard Lauren talking about quid pro quo, right? And
Mhm,
whether that is a form of sexual harassment, sexual assault, or not before. So if we can go to the next slide.
mhm,
So the issue of consent is one that haunts women and workers and advocates that are working in these cases because first of all, they don't disclose because survivors think that because they said yes and that they had quote unquote power to say yes, that that is not illegal, right? So talking about coercion as obviously the act of getting someone to act or think in a particular way by using threats or negative consequences or etc. for compliance is not just consent, right? Is coercion, and oftentimes the promises that go along with the coercion is better shift, better pay raise, improving working conditions, scheduling, not getting punished like my young worker that had to carry 40 pounds boxes all day long, avoiding physical harm to self or others, like firing someone else or not hiring someone else, etc. So it is very important always to explore coercion because unfortunately the quid pro quo and the coercion dynamic is not very well understood, and often victims blame themselves. I brought that up on myself because I said yes and I initiated this, and now I cannot get out of it. So just remember that. If we can go to the next slide, please. And finally, before we jump into the risks, remember that this slide has just a few ways in which sexual violence, sexual harassment, sexual violence manifests itself. Again, it can be physical, but it can be threats to other, or can take other forms that is not physical. And the challenge for us and our communities oftentimes is to break that barrier of understanding that perhaps in past experiences in other job situations in their countries, this was expected or this was the norm, but that there are protections and that regardless of immigration status, they can avail themselves to these protections. So let's talk a little bit about the risks. And Maria, we're going to jump because we don't have a lot of time left. We're going to jump to the next slide where we can see a big chart on the threats. Again, when we see a case and we identify a case, for us, as service providers and advocates and defenders, we want to jump into and start working on the case and get solutions and help her and connect her and work with her or him, right? But I just want you to look at this slide, and these are just a few of some key risks and threats that she may experience depending on the industry that she is employed at. Threats from the actual physical violence and they need for medical attention. They may or may not have insurance. They may or may not have access to medical attention. One of my clients used to go to, and she saved all the receipts. I don't know why, but hey, she used to go to Walgreens to get some sort of lotion to treat herself from the rapes because she was being sodomized and raped. And she couldn't get medical attention, and so she would self-medicate and get some stuff. And she had a conversation with the pharmacist in Walgreens about why she not that she was being raped, but what was going on, and how often it was happening to her. Not being productive at work, again, threats from violence, physical violence, missing work, not being able to physically take herself or himself to work and be present at work, injure herself from lack of concentration, trauma, gaps in memory, not appearing credible or appearing disturbed. Obviously, the threat from the perpetrator, we have all heard too much and too often about all of this, from firing her family members, blacklisting, changing shifts to punish himself or herself. I had a kid that would end going to work at 6 in the morning until 2 p.m. and then he had to go back into the lockers, change his clothes so it looked like he was starting a new shift just in case OSHA showed up, and go back to the line to continue to work as a punishment. Change positions to harder jobs, reduce hours, reduce paid, friends from their own coworkers, ostracizing the person, gossiping, treating her like a prostitute even though she is the victim, blaming her for changes in the work policy because she made it worse now for everybody. So all those attitudes of victim blaming, and the threats from employer, deter her from filing employment complaints, retaliate, stall or hold proceedings, alter investigations when they have begun, fire the worker, family members, etc. So again, as we get excited and we want to jump into these cases, it is very important to analyze what is she going to be facing. Are we prepared also? Is she prepared to be facing all of this? And we haven't talked about threats at home or threats, from the criminal system and barriers from the criminal system that are also present. So if we can go to the next slide, Maria. In the threats from reporting, one of the things that a lot of times stop my clients from moving forward and they want to think about it is, they are perhaps the only provider and they have kids, and the supervisor is the one providing the transportation to, in an isolated rural area, to the plant or to the restaurant or to wherever it is, and then the basic needs such as clothing and food and water and roof over their head and feeling safe and taking care of their children is at risk and at issue. So just along with, of course, being reported and deported. So if we can go to the next slide. During the next webinar, I will be providing you with a series of interviewing techniques. But for today, I want you to remember to start talking about it and to start listening and prompting questions or opening dialogues that may help you identify whether the workers that you're working with are at risk, are being threatened, and are experiencing sexual violence or sexual harassment, sexual violence in the workplace. If we can go to the next slide, Maria. So remember this, is she ready to talk about it? Does she want to disclose? Are you being too pushy? So how can you ask questions on a third person or generally that makes her feel comfortable? And then what are the relevant laws and policies? You'll learn more about it in the third webinar. Can you promise her something but not deliver? And are you going to be a failure, and put her really at risk of losing the only job that she can find or have? Who is in the workplace? Are they allies? What are the obstacles? Is it possible to do really something about this particular case? So all those questions, and all these challenges that unfortunately the survivor is facing is something that you need to ponder and consider as you're moving forward. And again, one of the, I guess, most important thing is to begin to talk about it. So what do you need to know to start the dialogue, and what do you need to consider? Are you going to make it worse, or are you going to really help? And for that, Giselle is going to help us to think about how to talk about it and what do we need to know. Giselle?
Thank you, Sonia. Maria, you want to change the slide? You are going to be in a very good position to hear the story because people are going to trust you, people are going to see you as an ally. They are probably going to come with you with questions about what's happening to them and wondering, how to tell you, how to tell somebody. And these are very difficult conversations because it is not a natural conversations. This is something that is normally very embarrassing, that people have a lot of fear, they have been intimidated. They are also not easy for you and for us because, every time that we are exposed to human suffering, we are sensitive and we are going to empathize with the person. We're going to feel their pain and their fear. And we have to be in our best position to be able to help them and not allow ourselves to be overcome by the emotion. And I know that, at least for me, there has been situations and stories where I hear a story, I hear what's happening to somebody, and I have to start having a little bit of water because I feel a knot in my throat. And it's very hard to think when you're feeling this way and to know how rationally you can help someone. Now, the first basis of hearing the stories will be to listen in a safe environment, so that if the person tells you, she's hesitant because she's afraid that she's going to be judged or that other people have told her that it was her fault or something, we want to provide them a reality check, in that, for instance, let them know that even when you consent, that has not been anything to do with a free will, when it has been a supervisor or an authority figure or somebody who holds a power over you. We can give them a reality check and we can be very validating of their feelings. If this felt wrong to you, then it probably was very wrong in general, and tell me more about it. And even just listening to them, we are bearing witness to what's going on, to what happened to them. And when we bear witness, when a person is able to talk about it, already the healing starts. One of the worst parts of trauma is keeping a secret, not being able to talk about it, being afraid of talking about it. Maria? I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I know that we have already gone through this a couple of times about, feeling that they need to obey or acquiesce because otherwise there will be disastrous consequences. And even disastrous consequences may be that their reputation is going to be harmed, even when there are no practical consequences as well. Next one. The key principles of what's going on with the people who are going to be coming to talk to us is that whether it is harassment, whether it is witnessing the harassment of someone else, or whether they are being assaulted or molested, it's going to be stressful. And every single stressful situation is going to leave consequences. It's going to have negative and sometimes positive consequences. Because when we are being in a stressful situation, our entire system is going to go into a different kind of way of dealing with things. And that's what we all know, and we have heard about it, about fight, fright, and freeze, right? That our body is going to be threatened, our mind is going to feel threatened, and our hormones and our system is going to get ready to either fight or freeze. Flight, fright, and freeze. So the person is going to be, these issues are going to be interfering with the person's ability to think rationally, because at that point we are just self-protecting. We are in a situation of danger. Sometimes what happens is that the person may not react the way she would have if she didn't have that fear, that she may say things or may acquiesce or may become dependent or even make decisions against her own protection, all because she is not acting in her best interest, because she's not thinking clearly. Next one. The distress from the abuse accumulates also depending on the nature, the intensity and the frequency. So like we talk about, sexual harassment could become very intense if it's very frequent, if it is happening, when we are in a very vulnerable position, sometimes not only vulnerable because the client is going to be an immigrant, a female, but sometimes it happens in situations where they are in the freezer, for instance, working alone, and that will be part of the intensity of the experience. Next one. The other issues of vulnerability have to do with whether they have had previous trauma. Women who come from experiences in their own countries or in the United States where they have been traumatized in the past, either because they suffered child abuse, even physical abuse, or poverty and deprivation, or accidents, or natural disasters, are going to be more vulnerable to being traumatized again with sexual violence in the workplace. Also, if they had any mental health issues, many times women have to leave in their country children or family and relatives and their entire network of social support and people that they love. And when they are here working, they are depressed, they are grieving. And these mental states is a vulnerability when they are being exploited sexually or when they are being harassed. Their own personality traits, women who are shy, who are submissive, age, young women who are very young and do not have experience on dealing with these issues, or women who are older and they feel that if they lose this job, there will be very little chances they get another one. Gender, issues of gender as well, issues of culture. In some cultures, we are told that we need to be very polite with our authority, that we have to always be agreeable, and also physical health and impairments as well. Next one. Okay. Preparedness for the event is another issue that can be harmful and contribute to the worsening of the traumatic experience. It could be either way, either that we're not prepared at all for it, like some women come from countries where the situation of sexual harassment was very difficult, and they thought, well, now I'm going to the United States, and oh my God, like it's gonna be so different here. I'm really just gonna work hard, and I'm gonna be valued for my work. And they are really surprised when they find out that there is all these issues again of oppression and sexual violence in the workplace. But it also can happen when they were prepared for it. They went to apply to a job, somebody told them, don't work with this supervisor because da-da-da, or, if they ask you to do this, don't. And then the woman works really hard to make her environment safe, and then something happened. That can be very traumatic because then she feels that she may need to blame herself for what happened. It also, another vulnerability will be when there are other stresses that are happening at that same time. You have someone ill at home, in your home country, you have to send money, or you don't have, like Sonia says, you don't have transportation. It's very hard to make it to work, and you have to ask for a lot of favors, those kind of things as well, including not speaking English. You have a PR person in the plant or in the organization, but she or he doesn't speak Spanish or the language that you speak. That's another stressor. Also, the quality of the immediate and long-term responses, like the social support, the institutional response, as we talked earlier. Women can be blamed for what happened to them. They can get a bad reputation. Co-workers may not understand. Husbands may not understand. Family members or friends may also take positions that are not helpful. And then after the event, whatever they do to recover also is going to help whether the intensity of the traumatic situation. Next one. Okay. When we talk about trauma, we talk about something that happened to a person and that a person is unable to deal with it. It overwhelms them. It's extreme proportions. And what happened with trauma is that it could be less or more intense. And we know by the way in which the symptoms are going to progress. Imagine that you wake up in the morning, you're rushing to work, you're driving to work, and you have a fender bender. And that is one extreme stress for that morning. Maybe you're late, maybe you have to wait for the police, whatever happens. And for the entire morning, you're going to be not yourself. You're going to be worried, you're going to be feeling vulnerable, you're going to feel really upset, maybe angry, maybe sad, maybe guilty. But then over time, it's going to dissipate. So what happened there was that it was not a regular stress that you can didn't have coffee in the morning. You probably get over that within 15, 30 minutes. But it was a little stronger, so it takes you longer because your body and your mind was not ready to deal with it very quickly. So when it is extreme proportions, then you just can't deal with it. You don't get over. You keep thinking about it, you dream about it, you worry every day, and you start building your life around that situation, that trauma, especially when it's a workplace environment that is happening every day, that is happening every other day. Your life is all around protection. Next one. Understanding this is very important when you talk with the people who bring their stories to you, because you can also tell them, they can tell you things such as, I think I'm going crazy. I should be able to deal with it. I know I need to ignore it, but I just can't. And you can say, no, it's perfectly normal that you are feeling this way. It is perfectly normal that you're feeling anxious, that you're feeling panicky, that you stare into space when you're supposed to be working, that you have flashbacks of what happened, or that you forget about it. That every time you see this person, you start acting frightened. That you're looking to see who's around you, what's going on. Even issues such as using alcohol, using drugs, getting sick, having problems with impulse control, or being angry. And those are normal because you are under an extreme stress situation. Next one. And then what happens is that sometimes the body stops having all those short-term responses and then settles into long-term consequences. For instance, low self-esteem, feeling that no man is going to ever like me because this happened to me. I'm never going to have a partner. I'm never going to have anybody that is going to love me. Or they are unable to make decision making. Perhaps they did something that feel guilty about it, and they feel they cannot trust themselves anymore. Or difficulties to manage emotions. They just start crying very easily. Difficulties to trust others, and sometimes even irrational thoughts about hurting themselves or killing themselves, or things like that. Next one. This is a little bit, I just like this one, but it's just what I told you before, that it is everything comes together, right? The trauma will be impacted by the isolation, by the lack of information, by cultural issues, by immigration, language, and other stresses. Next one. When you are talking about this with the person that comes to speak with you, you want to balance your validation with also asking questions, asking gentle questions, because you want to understand, but also because, like Sonia told you, if you listen and you ask, you may get a whole lot of other information that they're not telling you from the very beginning. Sometimes because they don't know, like the woman who told Sonia, I just don't want to have sex at work. Or I have had clients who also tell me, well, what happened is that this was a transgender person who, what happened was that the supervisor was outing him all the time. And he just didn't think he was very uncomfortable, but he didn't know if that was right or if he had any right to complain about that. But if you ask them about it, what happened when you started working there and what happened with this and other things, then you're going to get a lot of information that can help you with the case, but also sometimes discover other issues that are really serious. And what happened is that when people talk about it, the critical symptom of trauma is avoidance. And that is that we don't want to talk about it, right? We don't want to talk about it. We forget about it. We don't want to think, or we don't want to acknowledge that's happening to other people, or we minimize it, or we say, well, it wasn't that bad. I'm going to get over it. And we want to know that those are issues that are normal and that the client needs to work over through to those issues, because it's not that they are not cooperating, they're not collaborating, it's that they are just using the mechanisms to deal with it. And it's only a testament of how intense and how traumatic the experience was. And the next one. This is another chart that tells you about some of the direct and indirect ways of coping with the abuse. And the reason why I like these charts is because of the indirect. Sometimes the client will tell us, well, I just can't do anything about it, or I didn't do anything about it, or there was nothing I could do. But if we ask questions, we may find out that they actually did a lot. They just didn't do direct kind of reporting. They didn't quit their job. They didn't make a report. They didn't fight back. But sometimes they started dressing dowdy. Sometimes they call in sick. Sometimes they try to have someone with them at all times, have a friend that, will try to protect them perhaps. They will try to distract the supervisor with the stories, with other things. They tell sometimes their friends, they tell their priest, they go along up to a certain point. Even when they do that, they're trying to deal with it. They're trying to see, how am I going to get out of this situation? They may get a boyfriend. They may tell their boyfriend or their husband to pick them up at the end of the work day and be able to use that as an excuse. And I think that's my last chart, right? Yep. Thank you very much. Sonia?
So, Giselle, I think Debbie is going to perhaps open up for some questions and answer and tell us what's coming.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everybody, and thanks for taking part in this. I know this is a long time for you to be away from work, but we really appreciate you participating. And I know there's so much going on today with the shutdown and the change in the shutdown. But I just wanted to alert people to the webinars that are coming in the future on February 12th, working with immigrant survivors and the holistic approaches, and the third webinar, which is going to be March 8th, which will be addressing legal remedies, and we'll have Kachin from 32BJ participating, Monica Gazar, outside counsel from USWW participating, and Lauren continuing to participate, as well as Sonia and others. So I know there's not much time left, but if anybody has any questions that they'd like to type in, please go ahead and do that. We'll take a minute to answer if there's any questions that people want to share. I don't see anything. Do you see anything, Maria or Sonia?
No, there are no questions.
Okay.
But
well, thank you so much. Go ahead.
If anyone has questions, you can send to any presenters and we will get it back to you.
Right. And we will be sending some materials and again, the PowerPoints after we finish the presentation today. And if you have any follow-up questions, we'll be glad to answer in the future.
And thanks again to the wonderful speakers, Lauren, Giselle, Sonia, and to all of you for participating in this important webinar.
Thanks to everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.